So, without further ado, let me ask Philip Salmon to give our first presentation. Yeah.
I've added one extra question to my title, which you'll see on the programme. So the first two questions are sort of introductory, and the last one I've added is how did the secret ballot affect voting behaviour? There are a few extra things to say about that on the basis of some more recent research I did in the run-up to obviously preparing this paper. So the secret ballot, which we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of this year, is obviously considered to be one of the major electoral reforms of the 19th century, alongside extending the vote to ever wider sections of the population, including eventually, of course, women. The introduction of equal-sized constituencies and limits on election spending, secret voting is usually seen as a key improvement in the UK's representative system, particularly in terms of obviously tackling corruption and the coercion of voters by employees and landlords. Now, the fact that the popular view of 19th century elections, particularly as satirised by Dickens or more recently Blackadder's say Danny on the Wold, is one of alcoholic excess, disorderly behaviour and bribery, has only tended to make the move to secret voting, I think, seem more significant and necessary. We're all familiar with this negative but often highly entertaining depiction of Victorian polls and the many amusing anecdotes that accompany accounts of old-style electioneering. Joseph Gregor, of course, making full use of his personal collection of satirical cartoons, was one of the first to make a small fortune out of this whole genre with his hugely popular book, Elections in the Old Days, written just a decade after the end of public voting. And on our own Victorian Commons blog, where we highlight the research of the 1832-68 project, blogs about voter corruption, bribery, treating and drink, such as this one here, are also consistent crowd pleasers, attracting many more views than other topics that we write about. So this very bawdy image of Victorian elections held in a public voting system clearly continues to be extremely popular and pervasive. The problem with this view, though, is that it's extremely misleading, I think, in terms of the operation of the public voting system as a whole. Our ongoing work researching every election held between 1832 and 1868 in all the UK's 401 constituencies has unearthed a very different picture. Yes, people could be pressurised and intimidated to vote a certain way. And yes, bribery and corruption existed and were certainly aided and abetted by the fact that everybody's voting behaviour before 1872 was public knowledge. But the scale of these problems was limited, with more publicity usually being given to breaches of acceptable conduct rather than routine behaviour. Indeed, the press in many ways was just as guilty as historians have been of focusing on the most colourful and corrupt components of Victorian electioneering, often sensationalising stories to maximise their readership. And this, I think, helps to explain one of the striking dilemmas about the secret ballot. Why, if the Victorian public voting system was so bad and so unpopular, did it take so long for secret voting to be introduced? Some radical campaigners, of course, had been pushing for the secret ballot since the 1820s. But during the debates on the 1832 Reform Bill, virtually every shade of politician, Whigs, Reformers, Tories and even many radicals, queued up to defend public voting, ensuring that any proposals to include it were dropped. Now, one of the most common arguments made in favour of public voting, both then and over the ensuing decades, was of course public accountability. The idea that the vote was a trust or a duty that had to be exercised publicly in order to ensure that it was carried out properly. As the Prime Minister Palmerston, expressing the views, I think, of all the party leaders at the time, explained in 1858, an individual is invested with the power of voting not for his own personal advantage or interest, but for the interest and advantage of the nation, to be exercised in perfect daylight and be open to the criticism of our friends and neighbours and the public at large. And most of the early Victorian MPs that we're researching held similar views. Speaking on the hustings at the 1859 election, for instance, the Berkshire MP Captor Lester Vernon declared, "Damn the secret ballot, give me the bold-faced Englishman who, with his hat on one side, swaggers up to the polling booth, and when the clerk says, 'For whom do you vote?' answers manfully and in the face of his neighbours. Now, this sort of openness, of course, was especially important at a time when only a limited number of people could vote. Rather than being completely excluded from the electoral process, non-electors could see and judge how everyone had polled. As a result, as our constituency articles show, non-electors often played a very prominent part in trying to influence how voters behaved. Women, in particular, feature frequently in surviving canvassing books and electioneering papers, with comments like, "Wife says he will vote," or "Sister promised," testifying to their role. And their role as influencers also helps to explain why they are so prominent in most depictions of open-air election scenes from the mid-Victorian period, including nice early photographs like this one here. But women, of course, were not the only type of non-elector. Working men, including all those disfranchised by the voting restrictions of the 1832 Reform Act, often played a significant role, setting up meetings and pressure groups to persuade voters and trying to influence shopkeepers or traders in a practice known as exclusive dealing. And this was not considered as inappropriate or unconstitutional as it might seem today. And many MPs deliberately targeted their campaigns at non-electors as well as voters. Even some of the radical Chartists, famous of course for their 6 points including manhood suffrage with the secret ballot, accepted that public voting gave at least some power to the unenfranchised. Fergus O'Connor actually called secret voting a mask on an honest face in his newspaper, the Northern Star, warning that its introduction would stop scrutiny into the acts of your trustees and destroy deference to popular opinion. Another vocal advocate of public voting was the so-called schoolmaster of liberalism, J.S. Mill, whose thoughts on parliamentary reform, published in 1859, staunchly defended the moral virtues of an entirely public voting system. And as these and so many other quotes and speeches from supporters of public voting from across the political spectrum show, voters were not only expected to be held accountable to public opinion, but were also encouraged to act on behalf of their neighbours and communities when casting their votes. As one MP explained during an 1841 campaign, "The vote is public property. The elector is only a trustee, and you, the non-electors, have the right to scrutinise and to direct the voter's choice." Now, I say votes in plural there because another overlooked factor that helped to underpin this concept of voters representing non-voters was that most electors in England at this time didn't just have one vote, but had two. And owing to the predominance of double-member constituencies in England, which returned to 2 MPs, 96% of the English electorate had 2 votes at their disposal during the 1832 to 68 period. And comments like, "I give one vote for myself and one for my neighbour," or "I cast my first vote for the Duke and my second for my interests," litter the election inquiries of this period. And one particularly common form of behaviour linked to public voting was what contemporaries termed one-and-one voting. Now, before looking at this though, given what I've said about the positive benefits associated with public voting at the time, and I could list many more, it is worth briefly noting why secret voting was introduced, how it has to be asked, did the act we're marking the anniversary of actually get passed? Well, it certainly wasn't because of a hugely successful campaign waged by radical MPs in Parliament. Ballot motions only passed the Commons in very thin houses when the bulk of MPs were absent. Before Gladstone as Prime Minister took up the cause in 1868-9, the number of MPs supporting the ballot never topped the tally achieved on the 18th of June 1839, when 216 MPs voted in its support, but over half as many again, 333, against. It also wasn't because of the mass mobilisation or organisation of popular opinion out of doors, of the kind, say, waged against the Corn Laws. The ballot did become a popular demand in the 1830s, we'll be hearing about later, especially in larger constituencies after the 1835 and 37 elections. And there was a ballot society in existence from 1853 to 65. But this was never really an issue that galvanised the entire nation. Even in the 1868 election, held after the dramatic extension of the franchise by the Second Reform Act, surprisingly few candidates actively called for the secret ballot in their election campaigns. As Disraeli correctly noted in his famous 1871 speech against the ballot, drawing on, well, for him, some unusually accurate statistical work he'd carried out. Only 151 of the MPs elected in 1868, so this is barely a quarter of the Commons, were signed up supporters of the ballot, according to their election addresses, speeches, or previous votes. So why was secret voting introduced? Well, as a number of historians have noted, the introduction of this particular reform was very much a ministerial initiative, in other words, high politics, taken up by Gladstone in order to satisfy new cabinet colleagues like John Bright and his Home Secretary Henry Bruce. It was, as the Tory MP for Cambridge University, Beresford Hope, put it, entirely a party measure, pushed forward as a desperate attempt to unite the Liberal Party and not with a view to the benefit of the country. Now, a lot more could be said about the battles that raged in Parliament between 1870 and 1872 over Gladstone's secret ballot bills, battles which were not simply about the merits of public and secret voting per se, but also about the motives behind Gladstone's adoption of the measure and the tactics he then used to force the bill through the Commons. A lot more could also be said about the extraordinary showdown, what the Times called a violent collision, that occurred between the Commons and the Lords over secret voting, as depicted in this cartoon, creating a standoff between the two houses which lasted almost 18 months and had a number of important constitutional consequences. Instead, though, what I'd really like to highlight in my final comments here is the impact that the secret ballot had on the behaviour in those voting behaviour in those double-member constituencies where voters had 2 votes at their disposal. Now, in double-member seats, it needs to be remembered, electors could either select 2 candidates from the same party, casting a straight party vote, or they could split their 2 votes between candidates from different parties in a form of non-party or cross-party vote. Alternatively, they could withhold one of their votes and select just one candidate, casting what was termed a plumper. One of the most common forms or popular forms of behaviour associated with public voting was the non-party or cross-party vote. Explaining to a parliamentary inquiry why he had always split his 2 votes, Richard Harris, a Totnes blacksmith, observed that it was in order to please both parties, adding, "I work for both sides." "I give one vote for principle and the other for interest," noted one Blackburn elector. As a Conservative election agent explained to another 1852 inquiry, "There are a great many respectable tradesmen who usually vote not with regard to any politics, but from a desire to serve families and friends in the town who deal with them. And there are many respectable voters who always, at a general election, almost invariably divide their votes so as to offend neither party." So whether motivated by a need to represent other people, including non-electors, or a desire not to offend, cross-party voting was clearly a popular form of behaviour in the age of public polling. How then, we must be asked, did the move to secret voting affect these forms of electoral behaviour? If publicity was one of the driving forces behind one-on-one voting, pleasing both sides, did it decline after the introduction of the secret ballot? And how would the move to a written rather than an oral method of polling affect the voters' ability to navigate all the complex voting permutations, usually 10 combinations at least, on offer in multiple member seats? Now, it might be thought that the introduction of secret voting would prevent us knowing the answers to these questions. Voting became secret. But detailed breakdowns of the way people voted in multiple member constituencies, that's the precise numbers of plumpers and double votes cast by individual electors that make up those final tallies, they continue to be made available after 1872, reflecting, I think, their importance to party managers and politicians. And of course, the very first parliamentary elections to use the secret ballot, which attracted huge publicity at the time and of course command the bulk of historical attention, were not multi-member elections, but by-elections, such as the Pontefract by-election of 1872, where the new system seemed to work relatively smoothly. Later on in 1872, however, issues began to emerge in the multi-member municipal elections, where 2 or more councillors were being elected. Reports of electors inadvertently crossing the wrong combinations of boxes, because the official ballot papers listed the candidates differently to the polling leaflets they had received, or of electors being confused about how many crosses they could use, or even writing their names on the paper, as they had done previously in municipal elections, These filled the local newspapers. Illiterate voters appear to have had a particularly difficult time. Great fun, in a typically cruel Victorian fashion, was made out of one gaily attired female voter at Sheffield's 1872 council elections, who, after stating loudly that she could not read, had to be physically stopped from shouting out her choices by the returning officer. She was promptly taken aside, made to whisper her choices, one of whom actually wasn't standing, and then given a lecture about learning to read. The biggest problem, however, which was to become an extremely significant issue in the 1874 general election, was the question of how to cast a good old-fashioned plumper. Shortly before the 1874 election, the Reading Mercury published this extraordinary, but by no means uncommon advice. If the voter intends to vote, all he has to do is put a cross against the names of the candidates. Of course, if the voter intends to give up plumper, 2 crosses must be written opposite the name of the candidate thus favoured. Reports soon filled the press of voters up and down the country either intending to or actually casting multiple votes for one candidate, all of which, as agents and their candidates frantically tried to point out, invalidated their ballot papers. Many newspapers, especially the London-based journals, blamed the confusion about plumping on the cumulative voting introduced alongside the secret ballot for London's school board elections in 1870. Under this system, voters could and often did cast multiple votes for a single candidate. The Standard reported that because of the popular conflation of secret voting with cumulative voting, a widespread and serious misapprehension exists as to the mode of voting, especially among working men whose votes will be entirely thrown away. The plumping problem, however, was not just confined to London. In Brighton, one horrified Conservative candidate reported receiving multiple letters of support from voters saying, "I shall give my 2 votes for you." Fearing the worst, on the eve of the poll he issued a special address, warning that if my voters shall commit that error, hundreds, if not thousands of votes will be lost. In East Sussex, it was noted that a very common error prevails, even among people who would not care to be thought ignorant, that they may give 2 votes to any one candidate. This is a great mistake. In Sunderland, one Draper, questioned by a candidate, said he meant to give him his 2 votes. And things got so bad in Glasgow, which, like London, was subject to the additional confusion of the minority clause, that special notices had to be issued telling electors that you cannot give more than 1 vote to any one candidate or mark more than 1 X after the name of such candidate. Now, plumping was just one of the traditional forms of voting in multiple member seats that clearly did not translate smoothly onto a modern ballot paper. Many voters also struggle with selecting the correct combinations of candidates, just as they had done in the first secret municipal elections. Aided by the efforts of local parties and adverts in the partisan press, like these here, a deluge of information and advice about how best to support either the local Conservative Party or the Liberals quickly became available in most constituencies. But where did this leave the non-party voters, the backbone of the old public voting system, whose votes, it must be remembered, accounted for 1/5 of all those cast between 1832 and 1868. The analysis I've done so far indicates that cross-party voting and non-party plumping both declined significantly in the 1874 and 1880 elections, for the first time dropping below 8%. The move to secrecy, it seems, not only removed some of the incentives that lay behind supporting both parties, but also the ballot paper itself seems to have made the whole business of casting non-party votes more complex and liable to confusion, requiring a greater political awareness and level of knowledge. And perhaps not surprisingly, I've yet to find any newspapers or polling leaflets offering advice to voters about how to cast 1-on-1 votes using the secret ballot. So time to very quickly sum up. First, what's clear from our research on the 1832 to 68 project, and you can follow more of that on these various websites, is that the Victorian public voting system was far more participatory than is often portrayed. Yes, people could be pressurised and intimidated unfairly to vote a certain way, but the upside, which we hear a lot less about, is that public voting allowed all those without a vote to see and influence how voters behaved, as part of a very vibrant political culture that often engaged entire communities. And secondly, public voting remained hugely popular, with a broad range of leading politicians, even many radicals, for decades after 1832. It was only brought to an end because of high politics and manoeuvres at the ministerial level, rather than any successful outdoors democratic campaign or popular reform movement putting irresistible pressure on Parliament. And thirdly, many of the traditional forms of voting behaviour associated with public polls, including various forms of non-partisanship, did not translate smoothly onto the ballot paper in England's multiple member seats. Plumping and splitting, in particular, became far more problematic and confusing for voters left to their own devices in the solitary secrecy of the polling booth. And it would not be long, of course, before this entire system of multiple votes and being able to make non-party choices would be almost completely abolished, making the use of the secret ballot much more straightforward. After just one more general election and yet another dramatic expansion of this franchise, most of the UK shifted to winner-takes-all single-member seats, a system that, for better or worse, of course, continues to define our modern party politics today.
Thank you. Fascinating and perfect timekeeping.